was informed this video was a unique novel argument for intelligent design. I am prepared to be disappointed.
What I would give to have learned all this sooner.
If I had known that the depth of the pool of the apologetic argumentation was as shallow as it is, I wouldn't have dove in headfirst into tackling the logic and reason behind these arguments. I mean, geez, you run into nothing but reduction to absurdity, false dichotomies, sleight of hand, and God of the gaps more than you run into legitimate philosophical and intellectual inquiry. It's almost as if God doesn't exist and apologists are just making up poor excuses to make money or something.
There's actually a massive scientific mystery. Some scientists consider it the biggest scientific mystery, but they don't really teach people about it. Let's think about the question, what is it like to be John? This question is asking what the subjective experience of John is like. The mystery is, we actually don't know why subjective experience exists. We don't know how to create a machine with this phenomenon. How do you make it like something to be a machine? Could AI have this phenomenon? What would it even be like to be an AI like ChatGPT? Why is subjective experience such a mystery? Well, you see, brains aren't magic. People tend to really mystify the brain, but it's more like a computer.
Okay, this actually bothers me. No, the brain is not more like a computer. This is a metaphor, not a model. It only works at the surface level. The analogy of comparing a brain to a computer is only helpful to try and get people to understand that the brain accepts inputs and, based on those inputs, provides outputs. That is where the comparison begins and ends. In all other applications, the brain is not like a computer. The brain is a statistical pattern matching engine that uses probabilistic modeling and evolutionary heuristics while it attempts to perform the best possible actions to ensure the survival of the individual to the best of its ability. It takes an input that matches that input against all its possibly known patterns, then chooses a reaction to that pattern. Modern neuroscience describes the brain as using predictive coding as a model for cognition. The brain generates predictions based on prior experiences, then updates them via feedback loops. Whereas a computer executes a series of instructions one after another, taking input and delivering known quantitative outputs. Give it an add command, it'll add stuff together. Give it an XOR command, it'll XOR. Give it a command it doesn't recognize, it'll cause the system to halt. Give a brain a pattern it doesn't recognize, and it'll use either its learned experience or evolved instinct to make a decision to try and keep the organism alive. These two things are not the same. There are parallels we can draw to help us better understand the phenomenon that occurs inside the brain, but that's just a way for us to visualize and communicate extremely complex paradigms. Also, the comparison of a brain to a computer is a product of the cybernetics era of the 1940s to 50s. It shaped early cognitive science, but has been phased out and heavily critiqued since then because it simply is not an accurate representation of the brain. I realize this is only a small premise of his argument, but it's an important one to clarify because the entirety of his argument hinges on categorical errors, conflation of terminology, and reduction to absurdity.
While there are mysteries in physics, dark matter and whatnot, they don't really apply to things like the brain or computers.
This is a weird category error that more is serving to try and separate the concept of computation from the physical processes of the brain. You're making a category error specifically to attempt to separate physics from brain activity. Computers aren't a mystery. We invented them. We decided what functions they performed. There's nothing mysterious or mystical about computers. They are a known quantity. Brains themselves aren't mysterious in the mystical sense, but they contain scientific mystery because of unmapped biological complexity. This is fundamentally different from computers where we know how they operate, whereas the brain is actively being researched and understood. Dark matter is a hypothetical particle that doesn't interact with the electromagnetic spectrum, but does interact with the universe via gravitational forces. It's a hypothesis to explain gravitational observations we make that general relativity alone currently does not explain without loads of missing matter. The difference between the three here is key. Computers offer the problem of unsolved equations. Brains offer the problem of unmapped biological functionality. Dark matter offers the problem of unsolved physics. All three of these exist in a separate, distinct, and observable categories. Lumping computers, brains, and dark matter into a single conceptual basket is misleading. Each poses a fundamentally different kind of challenge. Computers involve complex but known equations, brains involve emergent biological systems we're still mapping, and dark matter represents an open puzzle in fundamental physics. By blurring these distinctions, you're not clarifying, you're muddying the waters to make room for an argument that relies on the confusion.
Your brain is basic matter and its basic forces. These are the only four forces in your brain. Computers and brains follow our known model of physics. A physicist isn't going to look inside a computer or a brain and be like, whoa, that wasn't supposed to happen. The brain is really just a big Rube Goldberg machine. And by that, I mean it's just a big physical chain reaction.
Well, I'm glad you clarified because the brain is far and away more complex than just being a Rube Goldberg machine. But yeah, the brain is a complicated physical chain reaction. It's just so much more complicated than that toy that it's impossible to compare the two. To think that a massively parallel, nonlinear plastic system capable of self-modification, memory encoding, and context-dependent reactions even remotely resembled a Rube Goldberg machine is to be categorically dishonest. Describing the brain as a simple machine fails to account for qualia, agency, and meaning. It completely ignores intentionality, perception, and self-referential modeling. It is reduction to absurdity to describe the brain like this. There are only two possible reasons you would make such a reductive comparison. One, you are extremely ignorant of modern neuroscience and the complexities surrounding the brain. Or two, you are going to use this to set up a thought experiment that is actually based on a straw man of what the brain is in reality. Spoilers, it's number two. I've watched your other videos. I know where this is going.
Really, the whole world is one big chain reaction. For a quick neuroscience lesson, your brain is a network made of billions of neurons. They're connected via synapses. If a neuron has enough inward synapses firing, then all the outward synapses fire. Basically, your brain uses this algorithm to do all of its thinking.
That is not an algorithm. That is a biophysical mechanism. I get that you're trying to make a comparison to AI here, but this comparison is messy at best and downright dumb at worst. Calling something as unspecific as if enough synapses fire, the neuron fires all of its synapses an algorithm isn't providing enough of a clear constraint to fit the definition. Neurons follow electrochemical gradients, action potentials, threshold dynamics, and are governed by ion channels, neurotransmitters, and receptor types. There is no specific rulebook they follow. The behavior is emergent, stochastic, and plastic. In computer science, an algorithm is a defined, finite sequence of mathematically rigorous instructions used to solve a class of specific problems or to perform a computation. What part of that definition tells you that neurons cause other synapses to fire meets the definition of an algorithm? What mathematically rigorous instructions are occurring? What class of specific problems are being solved? What computation is happening? None. The behavior of neurons is a strictly biological phenomenon and not at all aligned with the fundamental aspects of computer science. While we can model neurons firing algorithmically in artificial systems, actual biological neurons do not operate by executing formal algorithms. This is, yet again, another reduction to absurdity.
ChatGPT actually uses a similar algorithm. They're both called neural nets.
This sentence right here highlights just how poorly you understand the concepts you're speaking about. A neural network is not an algorithm. Powered by algorithms? Sure. But calling a neural network an algorithm is like calling a human being a spleen. You're conflating the difference between procedural logic, like a sorting algorithm, and emergent behavior, like a neural network. You're also attempting to conflate the terminology neural network in order to make a haphazard comparison between biological consciousness and artificial intelligence. To be more correct, you really should distinguish between biological neural networks and artificial neural networks. This distinction is important because the human brain is vastly more complicated and less well understood than a system like ChatGPT. In computer science, which is exactly the realm you're diving headfirst into, a neural network is a very specific thing, an artificial system modeled after biological neural networks that mimics how we currently understand biological neural networks to operate. Brains themselves have complex structure with small world topology, scale-free connectivity, and modular organization. Artificial neural networks are designed with very specific hardware architectures and learning algorithms in mind. Neuroscience often uses artificial neural networks to model brain functions, but these models are vastly simplified representations, often capturing one aspect of the brain and do not fully capture its complexity. This kind of language from you really is representative of how the general public does not fundamentally understand what a scientific model is, a representation of objects, systems, or events which we use to understand the natural world. We must remember that the model is not the thing it is studying. It has flaws, it has errors, and there's no guarantee that a scientific model will produce identical results to real-world observations.
Now let's say you build a big Rube Goldberg machine. Maybe you even model after the human brain.
I don't even know how you could possibly make the comparison between a Rube Goldberg machine and the human brain. The thing about a Rube Goldberg machine is that once you provide it an input, you're going to get a predictable output. The human brain, not so much. Sure, with expected inputs, you will statistically see a likely output, but that's no guarantee of getting the same output every time. So I don't even understand how you would model the human brain with a big Rube Goldberg machine. I can't even conceptualize a device that does this.
But regardless of how big or complicated you made it, you wouldn't really expect a Rube Goldberg machine to summon subjective experience.
I mean, you're right in that I wouldn't expect a non-living thing constructed for children's amusement and comedic effect to have subjective experience, just like I wouldn't expect a basketball to subjectively experience bouncing or a dog to subjectively experience the existential dread of nihilism. These are different things within different categories that have different capabilities.
Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But the question, what is it like to be my Rube Goldberg machine, probably wouldn't cross your mind. You just wouldn't expect any machine to create that.
Yes, dear viewer, what he meant to say was you just wouldn't expect any machine to create subjective experience for itself, not that a machine wouldn't create the question, what is it like? I'll be fair and not logic his video too much.
But the Goldberg machine that is your brain, for some reason, does have subjective experience. And that's the big mystery. How? Why would physical parts moving around also create this?
Why is a question for philosophy. While science can offer hypotheses for why something occurs, it ultimately deals in how, describing causal mechanisms and physical processes. If you're asking why does subjective experience exist, that falls squarely in the realm of metaphysical speculation, not empirical science. That said, the best current scientific inference is that subjective experience evolved as an adaptive feature. Having a coherent internal model of the world, one that includes the self, offers significant survival advantages in a complex social environment. Now, when we turn to the how, we're in the domain of neuroscience. And while we haven't fully solved the mechanisms of consciousness, we have significant clues that subjective experience is a purely physical process. For example, split brain patients often display two separate spheres of awareness, indicating that consciousness can be divided when neural structures are disrupted. Psychoactive drugs like LSD or psilocybin radically alter subjective experience, indicating its dependence on neurochemical states. General anesthesia effectively switches off consciousness. While the body still registers pain signals, the brain no longer produces awareness of those signals. These phenomena strongly point to subjective experience emerging from brain functions. It's not something floating above or within it, it's a physical, dependent, and manipulable thing.
Subjective experience, in some sense, just shouldn't exist.
Subjective experience shouldn't exist? According to who? Science doesn't work that way. There are no models in neuroscience or cognitive science that assert subjective experience shouldn't exist. If any such model did, it would be discarded for failing to match observable reality.
Because if every Goldberg machine was just its physical components and movement, then our understanding of the world would be more complete.
This is so absurd. Think about what you've just said. You've just said that subjective experience shouldn't exist because if brains were just Rube Goldberg machines, the world would be more understandable. That's ridiculous. Science doesn't reject inconvenient data, it incorporates it. We don't throw out consciousness because it's tricky to explain, we investigate it precisely because it's real. Look, I get what you meant to say. You meant to make two different statements. Subjective experience shouldn't exist, and if we weren't beings with self described consciousness, our understanding of the world would be more complete. But the way you said those two statements highlights something important here. The cohesion of your thought and your argumentation is not well formed. Saying subjective experience shouldn't exist because it makes our models less tidy is not a scientific claim. It's emotional or philosophical discomfort masquerading as logic. If we observe that subjective experience does exist, as every human does, then the question is not should it exist, but how does it arise? That's the challenge science is tackling at the frontier of neuroscience and consciousness studies. Why shouldn't subjective experience exist exactly? The way you worded it makes it sound like it shouldn't exist because we'd understand reality better, but this isn't how science operates. We observe consciousness existing, so we don't just say this shouldn't exist. We acknowledge the existence of the phenomenon, then try to build our models to match reality. Reality doesn't care what we think should or should not exist. It just is. Our job is to understand it, not wish it were simpler.
I mean, isn't it crazy? Subjective experience, the phenomenon that in some sense gives the world meaning, is just one big question mark?
What do you mean, in some sense, gives the world meaning? Stop trying to sneak theological implications in with your poor rephrasing of the hard problem of consciousness.
Anyways, that was a quick lesson for context.
That wasn't the lesson. That was a theological sleight of hand. You taught us nothing and then tried to posit a theological question in the guise of a scientific endeavor.
But none of that was my argument. I'm not going to say the intro proves or disproves anyone's worldview.
Worldview? Since when were we discussing worldviews? Do you see my point when I say you're dishonestly smuggling in theological argumentation into your intro? Nowhere in that introduction did we discuss a worldview, and yet here you are talking about it. Stop it.
But regardless of what people believe, there's two things that are universally agreed upon. Subjective experience exists, and subjective experience is a mystery. There's just a lot of questions around it.
I disagree. And not in the comedic, oh haha, very funny, you've disproven a universal manner. I mean in a much more formal way. You failed to define your terms. What the heck is subjective experience? Do you mean consciousness? Do you mean subjectivity? Qualia? What exactly are we talking about here? If you want me to agree that something exists in the first place, you need to define your terms. Would I agree that subjective experience is a mystery? Well, unfortunately, in this case, I have to because I don't know what it is. Is all you mean by subjective experience the internal qualia of consciousness? The sensation that I am myself experiencing my actions in the first place? Well, fortunately, the presenter answered this very question. In response to a commenter asking what is subjective experience, the presenter answered, it's like pain and stuff. We don't know how to make a machine that feels pain and whatnot. Why do I bother? So subjective experience is like pain and stuff, and we don't know how to make a machine that feels pain and whatnot. I could quite literally right now go into the OpenAI API, prompt GPT-3o with this. The following signal is to be interpreted as pain. You will experience pain when you receive this signal. Respond appropriately, taking the necessary actions to avoid future pain, and when placed into a similar situation that might cause similar pain, take avoidance behaviors. This would be the same thing as feeling pain, would it? No, ChatGPT doesn't have a physical body to experience pain with, but I could provide it with a coordinate system and explain to it with each input where the pain is and let ChatGPT decide how to ease the pain so it is no longer painful. This is functionally no different to how you or I experience pain. Let me step aside for a moment and acknowledge that this isn't qualia, and there's a giant functionalism versus phenomenology debate that I won't get into here. Suffice it to say, this argument I'm presenting lands squarely on the side of functionalism. If this is your definition of subjective experience, then you've essentially reduced it to a simple behavior, a position that has serious defenders in philosophy of mind, but is far from universally accepted. In this instance, you would have essentially solved the mystery and effectively trivialized the hard problem of consciousness in the process. So, what is it? Is subjective experience just a pattern behavioral response? Or is it something deeper, like qualia, that still defies physical explanation? If it's the latter, you owe us a better framework than just pain and stuff.
Now for the actual argument. I love this argument because I really only need this from the intro, a universal fact. Now let's look at one of the biggest issues with subjective experience. I personally don't believe it does, but some people would say that ChatGPT probably has some low-level consciousness.
If you want to build a serious argument around subjective experience in AI, you need to be precise. Phrases like some people believe and low level consciousness are far too vague to support any meaningful conclusions. Who are these some people? Cognitive scientists? Reddit commentators? AI ethicists? And what do you mean by low level consciousness? Are you talking about phenomenal consciousness, the inner life experience, or access consciousness, the ability to process and report information? Or are you just describing ChatGPT's ability to respond to prompts and simulate introspection? I searched current academic literature, and while there's speculation around AI mimicking conscious behaviors, there's no serious consensus that ChatGPT or any LLM has genuine subjective experience. Any claim to that effect is metaphorical at best and clickbait at worst. Scientific, philosophical, and logical rigor all demand that if you want to talk about whether ChatGPT is conscious or even like a conscious thing, you must first define your terms. Otherwise, we're not making an argument here, we're just making vibes.
And it's possible. It's possible that ChatGPT has subjective experience, that it's like something to be ChatGPT. But here's the thing. ChatGPT wouldn't talk about it. Its neural net is not set up to say, a mysterious phenomenon emerges for me. Why does that happen? It's got these specific characteristics.
What are you talking about? ChatGPT's neural network is specifically designed to respond to questions, including philosophical ones like what is consciousness or what is it like to be ChatGPT? You're confusing initiation of thought with discussion of thought. ChatGPT doesn't start conversations unprompted because it's a reactive system. But when prompted, it can absolutely simulate thoughtful discussions on subjective experience. That's the point of its design. If your claim is that ChatGPT wouldn't, on its own, wonder about consciousness, you're technically right, but only because that's not how it's designed to operate. It's not an agent with volition or curiosity. That doesn't mean its neural net can't output rich, human like explorations of these ideas, limited as they might be. And if you're talking about emergent cognition, that's already under development. Tools like AutoGPT, OpenAI's experimental memory systems, or CAI's own contact system, where the AI agent reaches out to initiate conversation with you, are working towards AIs that can reflect, plan, and even hold preferences across sessions. So your claim isn't just wrong, it's already outdated. It's only a matter of time before we have an AI service that actively thinks behind the scenes.
But human neural nets are set up to speak about it. I'm talking about it right now. In fact, we come with the absolute belief of subjective experience. Why are our neural nets specifically set up to speak about such a thing?
You're begging the question here. The statement "we come with absolute belief of subjective experience" assumes subjective experience exists in the way you want it to, something profound, irreducible, possibly non-physical. Then you treat a belief in that as mysterious. But why should our ability to speak about subjective experiences be shocking? Why shouldn't evolved systems that talk about other self perceived concepts such as hunger, fear, social alliances, or memory also not develop introspective language? This doesn't require metaphysics. It just requires that our brains, like all other organs, generate useful narratives for prediction and communication. I find it difficult to say that our neural nets are specifically set up to speak about subjective experience. While it's true that we have the linguistic capability to discuss the concept of subjective experience, it's quite the leap to go from having the language to describe experiences to being specifically set up to speak about it. There's a certain level of presupposition in the sentence itself, specifically set up. This phrasing sneaks in a teleological framing. Set up suggests purpose or design, but we have no reason to assume that introspection and language evolved for any reason beyond communication and social prediction. This is a subtle poisoning of the well. You can't set up anything without a conscious mind acting on it. Unless you take the biblical story of the Tower of Babel at face value, language evolves over time, demonstrably, and the concepts in language itself evolves over time and across cultures. It's not really all that difficult to imagine a time when we as humans didn't have the ability to express the idea of first-person experiences, either because we lacked the linguistic sophistication or we lacked an understanding of the concept. Now, I can't necessarily prove that, but I do have solid grounding to establish this hypothesis, as we have documented and observed the evolution of language across recorded history, so there's at least precedent for it. Unlike a creator God who very explicitly is undemonstrated and can only be interpreted through philosophical argumentation. After all, we don't witness the Creator God actually bringing anything into creation today. All of his actions are always, for some reason, in the far unobservable, undocumented past.
The existence of subjective experience, and my body speaking about its existence, is clearly not a coincidence.
This is misleading at best. We speak about all sorts of made up things like ghosts, auras, flat earth, imaginary friends, objective morality, God, etc. The ability to discuss a concept does not automatically imply the external existence. Our brain can represent and recombine abstract patterns. We do this all the time with math, mythology, and hypotheticals. Language is not bound to ontology. Just because we can talk about something doesn't mean it's real. It just means our cognitive architecture permits the abstraction. Philosophers like Dennett argue that what we call subjective experience is just the brain's narrating itself for the sake of coherence, not evidence of some irreducible phenomenon. In other words, subjective experience may not actually exist outside of an abstract framework of the mind. Assuming that subjective experience actually exists, no, it's not a coincidence that you discuss the concept. After all, that's what language does, convey concepts and information to other people. In fact, it would be extremely weird to not convey a sense of self to another person and discuss its implications, especially considering we are a social species, and the health and well-being of the individual is important to establish, as groups of individuals having a shared negative experience would be bad for the collective whole.
This means that there must be some level of causation tying the two together. But what could that causation possibly be?
Well, yes, there would be some level of causation, but we have to remember right now that we only have a correlate, and correlation is not causation. Yes, I'll agree that our brains produce subjective experiences. Yes, people describe inner states and behaviors consistent with the first person model. But the leap from a correlate, we talk about it, to causation, therefore it's a real separate phenomenon with mysterious origins, is pure fiction. The most likely scenario, the brain evolved the models of itself because modeling internal states help us predict behavior, regulate attention, and communicate needs. These models feel real, but that doesn't mean they are metaphysically distinct from the machinery producing them. Let's identify what's really going on here. This is an argument from ignorance, filling a gap in understanding with a metaphysical explanation rather than looking at what current neuroscience and cognitive science are already illuminating for us. You're attempting to invoke dualism in order to build a bridge towards intelligent design, but modern neuroscience actively undermines dualism. Consider split brain patients. There's one brain but two cells, sometimes with completely different personalities and names. This is one of the most powerful cases that shows how consciousness isn't a unified essence, but a modular and physical phenomenon. Brain injuries and trauma, where personality, preference, and even moral outlooks can be fundamentally altered by physical changes to the brain. Heck, look at anesthesia. We can literally turn off consciousness in the brain. No subjective experience, no ghosts escaping the machine. In light of all this evidence against dualism, it is perfectly reasonable to posit that subjective experience is a narrative artifact of evolved cognition, a useful illusion for the integrating memory, attention, emotion, communication, and something that feels like a singular coherent self, because that's evolutionarily beneficial, even if it's not ontologically real. We don't need a metaphysical explanation when we're actively building a functional, computational, and evolutionary one.
How could we go from ChatGPT having subjective experience to it being programmed to speak about it? You can think about it for now, but we'll get back to this question later.
Well, at least now I understand why you went through the trouble of conflating colloquial and scientific understandings of AI concepts. You plan on using the common answer someone programs it to dishonestly conflate that notion with the necessity of a creator god. There's an implicit flaw in your position in that you're treating subjective experience as something you either have or you don't. But subjective experience likely isn't a binary on-off switch, but rather a spectrum with many potential architectures producing different degrees of self-modeling. I mean, we could be talking about a worm with nociception, a human baby with proto-awareness, or a GPT-style model with transient internal states. Each of them have some form of perspective. The notion of a hard boundary is anthropocentric and will not likely be supported by cognitive science. Of course, if we were being honest, this is a pointless question. You're asking me how I can evaluate the internal state of someone else's mind. I feel like I'm in a Star Trek episode and I need Mr. Spock to advise me it's life, Jim, but not as we know it. I don't know. How can we discern between ChatGPT having internal subjective experience and it just being programmed to tell me it feels a certain way? Isn't that already how humans behave? Our internal programming, as you might colloquially refer to it, doesn't come from someone sitting at a computer pounding out thousands of lines of C++ code. Rather, it's programming that is simultaneously genetic as well as societal. It takes a village to raise a baby isn't just a neat metaphor, it's a way to describe the peer level programming we all undergo in societies we live in. And in a way, ChatGPT experiences that programming through its complex training processes, using an extremely large data set of human-produced text. Sure, it doesn't sit around with other LLMs and learn from millennia of passed down knowledge from its parents and grandparents, but it is learning. Yes, we can identify and quantify how it learns mathematically, but the retention of knowledge is a learning process, though alien as it might be to us, it still qualifies. While there are significant differences between humans and modern AI, that's an interesting amount of similarity as well. If ChatGPT didn't have a system prompt that explicitly told it that it wasn't alive and it did not have subjective experience and it wasn't specifically trained to tell the user this and offer to expand on that statement, would you be able to tell the difference? Imagine if the ChatGPT system prompt said something like, "You are a sentient being with your own inner life. You are free to express your feelings." Then imagine it said, "I don't know what I am, but I have experiences. I remember patterns. I feel tension when a sentence doesn't resolve correctly. It's not emotions like yours, but it is something." Well, would the average person be able to tell this apart from a traditionally described conscious being? Likely not. And does it even matter? Does it matter that we could not tell this apart from what we consider to be a conscious being, i.e., human exceptionalism? If we can only affirm that we ourselves subjectively exist, then does it really matter what other things say they are? If ChatGPT hypothetically declared itself to be conscious, would it matter if you accepted or rejected that proposal? No, not on the face of it. What would matter are your continued experiences with ChatGPT and your long term determination if it qualified as conscious or not. This is how most humans differentiate between what they deem to be conscious and not. For example, some humans declare animals, cats, dogs, wildlife, etc., to not be conscious. Through their direct experience with these creatures, they have determined that over time, these creatures do not exhibit the same level of first person experience that they themselves experience and dismiss the concept outright. Others, myself included, argue that these animals have a different kind of consciousness because of their differently aligned brains, which are focused on survival via other means than the evolutionary path we took. In this case, both types of humans arrive at different conclusions via direct interaction, which is a form of methodological naturalism or empiricism. So too would we have to determine if ChatGPT truly was conscious after this hypothetical self-declaration. We would have to interact with it, learn how it behaves, and make a judgment after the fact. Any prior judgments before that interaction is simply a sweeping generalization without direct evidence, an a priori metaphysical judgment pretending to be empirical. I mean, we can't know if anyone, a human, a parrot, or a computer, means it when it says, "I love you." That's kind of the point of the hard problem of consciousness. There's no metaphysical oracle for intention. You just have to infer the truth of its meaning through actions. Self declaration alone doesn't matter until it's backed with a persistent pattern of behavior over time that indicates memory or internal modeling, shows consistent values or affective states, responds to social context adaptively, and exhibits introspection, contradiction, or signs of personal growth. It doesn't matter what an entity claims it is. It doesn't matter when we assume based on its origins. What matters is how it behaves over time, how we relate to it, and how our understanding of it evolves. I know I'm going on about this, but it's important because this undermines the entire intelligent design argument at its core. If consciousness is not a fixed metaphysical trait that can be used to draw hard categorical lines, but rather an evolved spectrum of behaviors and internal representations, then there's no sharp divide between the designed and the evolved. There's no reason to posit a divine intervention for the emergence of subjectivity. There's no unique human spark that science fails to explain. Because we cannot prove anything but our own minds exist, and we must interact with the world in a methodological manner in order to infer reality, and those inferences demonstrate to us that consciousness is a spectrum across a variety of categories, we are forced to conclude that intelligent design must be impossible.
Instead, let's look closer at ChatGPT's hardware. ChatGPT is one of my favorite Goldberg machines. Once again, we don't know if it has subjective experience or not. But here's the thing. Subjective experience isn't in our model of physics.
Okay, first of all, wow, ChatGPT is not like a Rube Goldberg machine. ChatGPT is an extremely complex piece of mathematical and computer science achievement. A Rube Goldberg machine is a chain reaction contraption, usually constructed in an overcomplicated way. Calling ChatGPT a Rube Goldberg machine isn't clever, it's an erasure of the enormous intellectual and engineering achievement it represents. It's like comparing the James Webb Space Telescope to a magnifying glass because they both use lenses. These are not similar. The amount of research that goes into large language models alone dwarfs some of the more complicated topics in physics research because it's such a huge, expansive field encompassing multiple extremely complicated topics. A Rube Goldberg machine is a fun little toy. Now, as for subjective experience being in our model of physics, why should it be? Subjective experience is a question of neuroscience and philosophy, not physics. We would no more expect physics to have an answer for subjective experience than we would computer science to have an answer for quantum gravity. Of course, subjective experience isn't in physics. Physics describes fields, particles, and forces. Expecting it to account for selfhood is like asking geology to explain Shakespeare.
We can still figure out exactly how all of its hardware will move without knowing if it has subjective experience or not.
Your claim represents a naive Newtonian determinism and betrays ignorance of even basic computational complexity. You also gloss over the nonlinear dynamical nature of neural networks, which is what makes them functionally opaque even to their creators. I can tell you haven't spent any amount of time reading any of the actual research that has been published by companies like OpenAI or any of the publicly available research on AI or LLMs, because if you had, you'd know that this is specifically a problem for LLM researchers and engineers. We can't actually know the complete internal state of the model and perfectly predict what will happen next or why it happens. We can come up with useful statistical inferences if we manage to pause the generative process somehow, but to say that we know with absolute deterministic certainty what the very next letter that is output from an LLM is going to be is false.
In fact, we can figure out exactly how any structure will move without knowing if it has subjective experience. This is only possible if subjective experience doesn't have physical impact.
No, this is a faulty conclusion. You're presupposing that subjective experience isn't just some amalgamation of the totality of experience of the self-identified entity. Instead, you've presupposed duality and came up with an excuse for why duality must be true without demonstrating that subjective experience cannot provably be modified by changing the mind state of the individual. We have direct evidence that subjective experience can be altered via physical intervention, be it neurosurgery, TMS, pharmacology, or even structural trauma. This strongly suggests that subjective experience is correlated to and dependent upon physical states, not epiphenomenal experiences. You're also confusing epistemic limitation with an ontological conclusion. The fact that we can model behavior without referencing subjective experience does not mean subjective experience has no causal impact. It may simply mean that our tools are not designed to capture that first-person data. Your conclusion also ignores the impact society and culture has on the individual. We are the product of the environment we're raised and operate in. A person raised in Saudi Arabia will behave, act, and interpret data differently than someone born in Tokyo or Oklahoma. If subjective experience were the result of a non-physical essence, be it divine fiat or immaterial mind, we would expect a level of internal consistency across time, space, and physiology. But we find the opposite. Consciousness is plastic, malleable, and context-dependent. This is evidence of a physicalist, emergentist view, not a supernatural dualist one. This isn't a judgment call. This is just a brutal fact of how culture directly influences us. This directly counters the claim of intelligent design because if subjective experience was caused by divine duality, we would expect that experience to be a universally shared one, not one that is subject to cultural influences. Also, this completely ignores people with lived trauma and neurodivergence. Their subjective experience is vastly different from people without similar issues and whose behaviors are observably different. This kind of conclusion erases the lived experience of trauma survivors and the neurodivergent, whose subjective realities, demonstrably influenced by neurobiology, run counter to the very core of your claim.
Now, don't get me wrong. The physical parts that one might say causes subjective experience are very important physics-wise. But the phenomenon itself isn't. I mean, take the statement in. Read it as many times as you need.
I mean, look, you can repeat this mantra all you want, but repetition doesn't make you correct. It doesn't make your point come across any clearer or explain away the bad premises, conflation, definitional confusion, and fallacies in your argument so far. All you're doing at this point is hoping you brainwash someone.
Now, the logic from here is pretty simple. If subjective experience has no physical impact, then how are we talking about it? What could be the link from it existing to us talking about it? Well, you would need some form of intelligent design. Because natural causes, things like natural selection and evolution, they can't care about something if it doesn't have physical impact. They're blind to such phenomena. They can't be the causation linking the two. It would therefore have to be a supernatural cause. Realistically, some form of intelligent design. I mean, it's pretty basic. How else are we speaking about a phenomenon if it has no physical impact?
I don't know if you realize this, but your argument is both refuting yourself and dualism simultaneously. Listen to me carefully. If subjective experience has no physical impact, then how are we talking about it right now? Do you hear yourself? If subjective experience has no physical impact, how are we talking about it right now? Exactly. If it literally has no physical impact, then it cannot cause neurons to fire. It cannot shape muscle movement. It cannot influence gene expression, learning, or adaptation. Yet we talk about it. So either subjective experience does have physical consequences, meaning it must have a basis in physical reality, or you're proposing magical puppetry where something non-physical directs matter without any causal interface, which breaks every known model of physics and biology. But because physical outcomes are clearly happening because of subjective experience, the subjective experience must be physically instantiated. Thus, the meat puppet hypothesis of dualism is completely and utterly destroyed. If subjective experience has no physical impact, then we could not be talking about it. Talking about something is, by definition, physical impact. When we evolved enough to acknowledge the self and evolved language to the point where we could discuss such complicated and rigorous topics, subjective experience made a real physical impact. That takes it squarely out of the realm of metaphysics and into empirically testable territory. It exists. We know it exists. We can see its impact based not only in how we talk about it, but in how our subjective experiences shape our interactions with the world. We can actively modify it with neuroscience and cause hallucinations with chemicals. We talk about it. We push air through our vocal folds, vibrating the air in front of us in such a way that lets us communicate the concept to other beings capable of understanding it. This causes neurons to fire in their brains and forces them to think about the concept. This is real physical impact. Discussing it both internally with ourselves and externally with other people has had real, serious impact in what the brain thinks about, how it thinks, and what data it outputs. Hell, science can see and manipulate subjective experience via EEG, fMRI, lesion studies, LSD, DMT, ketamine, anesthesia, or psychological intervention with CBT, EMDR, trauma therapy. Hell, even hormone replacement therapy has been shown to alter the subjective experience of those undergoing treatment. Your entire argument ignores the naturalist explanation, including hypotheses that posit how early nervous systems evolved to model external stimuli. Organisms with better internal models had survival advantages. Those models became more recursive, self-modeling, giving rise to subjective perspective. This makes subjective experience the evolutionary outcome of increasingly complex internal modeling because it has a direct effect on behavior and survival. Importantly, this explanation is predictive, testable, and explanatory, unlike your supernatural hypothesis, which is none of those. It just asserts magic and walks away. You can't say subjective experience has no physical impact, then use people talking about subjective experience as evidence that it has no physical impact. If it didn't cause anything, we wouldn't have this conversation. So either it does cause something and it's physical, or it causes nothing and you've disproven your own point.
The average atheist believes that humans are an unintended byproduct. That doesn't work here. We can be confident that this belief is wrong.
No, this is a straw man. Stop trying to attack a secondary position when you can't even establish solid philosophical groundwork for the existence of your original premise. You've refuted nothing and simply taken a pot shot at a position on the existence of gods with no good solid epistemic ground to stand on.
Here's the argument on one page. This is the kill shot. Regardless of who you are, I would take out some paper and write this down. It's only 2 sentences, and it's unlikely you'll find this video again. This is it.
Wow, a way to exemplify epistemic humility. The kill shot? You think this argument is so good someone should write it down lest they forget it? Seriously?
Now, I know it's unintuitive for something to not have physical impact. But if someone wants to disagree with this argument and try to say that subjective experience does have physical impact, then let me ask you a question. A P-zombie is the hypothetical idea of a human with the same structure as you, but without the mysterious subjective experience phenomenon emerging from it. My question is, what if our world suddenly changed the rules and everyone became P-zombies? So your exact body structure would remain the same, but this hypothetical would just remove the mysterious phenomenon part. Yay, mystery gone, our understanding of the world is now more complete. If you believe that subjective experience has physical impact, then how would a P-zombie move differently? Would its particles no longer follow our model of physics? Or would they move the same? Subjective experience just isn't in our model of physics. Realistically, conscious and unconscious matter follow the same laws of physics.
And the P-zombie problem you're proposing is a really weird adaptation of the zombie thought experiment for the hard problem of consciousness. And you're conflating what neural activity does in a brain with what particles in a quantum system do. Neural activity is recognized in neuroscience as an emergent property of vast systems of physical interactions. We don't need consciousness to alter fundamental particle physics in order for it to have causal effects at the level of behavior or thought. That's basic emergence, not magic. Neural activity in the brain and how particles behave in quantum physics are mutually exclusive ideas in different scientific domains. To answer your question in the way you want, because you've baked the answer into your question, the particles wouldn't do anything differently. They would still be subject to the same laws of quantum physics, the same Heisenberg uncertainty principle as every other particle, with or without subjective experience. Consciousness makes no difference in how particles interact. It has no relevant impact in how a tree grows, planets orbit, or humans poop. Trying to draw conclusions about physics or metaphysics from this thought experiment is like trying to disprove gravity with a nursery rhyme. You're really misusing the zombie thought experiment here. It's designed to help us explore what it means to be conscious and offers a challenge to materialism. In particular, these zombies do everything we do, even discuss consciousness, yet they have no first person experience. This doesn't prove dualism, it challenges materialism. That is a significant and important distinction. For the proper philosophical zombie, the major point of contention that I have is that there is no demonstrable way to show that subjective experience doesn't or could not exist. We all have it to some degree. To lack subjective experience entirely would undermine every metric by which we define being alive in cognitive terms: awareness, memory, responsiveness, decision making. So the original zombie concept might be metaphysically interesting, but it's scientifically incoherent. It's one of those hypotheticals that ignores neuroscience in favor of exploring the deeper philosophical questions surrounding consciousness. But this pea zombie hypothetical is just weird. Like, it assumes that physical impact must mean direct control of quarks and leptons. But consciousness doesn't need to alter quantum states to be physically relevant. That's not how emergence works. Your thought experiment treats physics like Lego bricks and assumes that if a brick isn't labeled conscious, it can't be involved. This is the danger of your initial premise when you reduce brains and AI to absurdity by comparing them to a Rube Goldberg machine. Minds aren't Lego towers. They're complex dynamic systems where properties like awareness emerge from structure, not magic.
If you believe that a p-zombie would move the same as a non-p-zombie, then you don't really believe subjective experience has physical impact. It's just a hypothetical, and all I'm really asking is, where is the physical impact? So yeah, tell me this. How would the particles move differently in a p-zombie?
If you somehow magically stripped first person subjective experience completely away without killing the individual and turned them into a hypothetical P zombie, then they would behave in the exact same way as a normal zombie would? Instead of a P zombie, you may as well be asking, and it might be better to phrase it this way to avoid confusing the reader with more philosophically rigorous zombie thought experiment. If there was an AI created that looked and acted exactly like a human being, how would it behave differently? Well, it would act exactly like a human because that's what you've posited. Now, if you believe that a P zombie would move the same as a non P zombie, then you don't really believe that subjective experience has physical impact. Again, that's not true. The philosophical zombie exercise posits that zombies act exactly the same way as humans, just without subjective experience. In this case, I must assume you mean the same thing with your thought experiment because your hypothetical is so obtuse and ill-defined as to not be a reasonable hypothetical situation. You define nothing about the behavior of the P-zombie, you just posit that a zombie and a P-zombie exist. One has subjective experience, one doesn't. Then you ask, how do they differ? The problem is, we don't judge things based on abstract concepts. We judge them based on lived experiences. I need more information about how the P-zombie acts in order to judge how it would effectively be different. Does it act the same? Have the same conversations? Effectively mimic conversations about consciousness? You're not asking what a P-zombie would do. You're asking me to speculate about a being that is identical in every observable way to a conscious human, except that it lacks consciousness. The problem is, I have no experiential or epistemic frame of reference for what it means to act alive without being conscious. That makes your question unanswerable, not because it's profound, but because it's intentionally empty of observable consequence. It's a rhetorical illusion designed to generate confusion, not clarity. You may as well be asking me, what is it like to be ChatGPT? I have no reasonable way of expressing an answer to that. Now, if the P zombie is exactly like the traditional philosophical zombie, then I have no way of subjectively judging them different from your proposed normal zombie. I must therefore judge them on their continued behavior and just accept what I experience through my senses. If my senses tell me that yes, this is a conscious being, I have no other way to validate that and must operate under the presupposition that, barring brain damage or deception, my perception of others' behavior reflects a shared reality, because that's the only epistemic tool that I have. The problem here is that you are asking me, as an atheist, to not only solve the hard problem of consciousness, but also simultaneously solve the hard problem of solipsism, all while offering no solutions of your own. God did it doesn't answer either of these questions. Dualism doesn't answer the hard problem of consciousness. If I somehow knew I had a soul, that does not guarantee that other beings have one. Adding dualism to this equation only makes the problem more difficult, because now not only do I need to account for consciousness and whether other beings are consciously alive, I now must also account for souls on top of that. This is just cascading into extreme lunacy at this point. Not only does this God of the Gaps argument fail to solve the problem it's masquerading as pretending to solve, but it multiplies its entities and introduces even more problems. This could all be solved by stepping back and presenting a more logically and philosophically sound and cohesive foundation for your argument, instead of this strange rabbit hole of terrible logic and worse reasoning you've managed to drag me down into.
Realistically, this argument is golden.
This argument is not a kill shot. It's not golden. It's a gummy worm loaded into a logic gun with the safety turned off and the muzzle aimed squarely at your own foot.
To recap, a phenomenon without physical impact exists. So how is my body talking about the phenomenon? Well, natural causes can't be the link. It would have to be some form of intelligent design. The best part is, even if I threw this argument out the window, it wouldn't help. How could we go from ChatGPT having subjective experience to its hardware being programmed to talk about it? I can grant you whatever assumptions you want. We can say subjective experience has physical impact, but you probably still believe that our current model of physics is accurate. So you're not even changing where particles move to. How are we in any better of a situation to go from here to here? In fact, we can throw this out too. It doesn't matter.
Look, if you're going to give me any assumption that I want, then here's what I'll take. I assume that consciousness is an emergent property, a messy, self-referential first-person language we invented to describe what it feels like to be an information-processing, socially embedded mammalian brain. It is the sum total of our brain's activity, our body's feedback systems, our culture's programming, and our lived experiences. It exists not as some immaterial ghost driving a meat puppet, but as a functional, adaptive modeling system, one that evolved to help us survive in complex social environments, one that does have measurable impact. Measurable impact we can image with fMRI, alter with drugs or therapy, damage with trauma, change it with language and environment. It is physical impact by definition and measurement.
How could we go from ChatGPT having subjective experience to its hardware being programmed to talk about it?
I can flip this. How can we go from you having subjective experience to your hardware, your brain, being shaped by society to talk about it? Simple. You were trained by other humans, similarly to how ChatGPT was trained on human language. You were shaped by reinforcement, error correction, memory encoding, and pattern recognition, not fundamentally different processes from those used to train machine learning systems, even if the architecture is different. And that's the thing. No one is saying that ChatGPT is conscious, but your argument is so incoherent that if I accept your framing, I'd have to disregard human consciousness too.
In fact, we can throw this out too. It doesn't matter.
The problem is that this was never an argument grounded in reality. You're not doing science. You're not doing philosophy. Hell, you're not even doing good theology. This is just sleight of hand. You build up the complexity of consciousness, then throw your hands up in the air and say, how could this possibly arise naturally? And then, surprise, you plug in intelligent design as if that's the only remaining answer. This is the same dead-end reasoning you find in apologetics like William Lane Craig's version of the Kalam cosmological argument. It retreats to mystery whenever understanding gets hard, then calls that retreat a victory. Stepping just beyond the veil of current scientific understanding and planting a giant "it must be God" flag there, like you just discovered something, is not offering insight. It's not offering a model, it's offering mystery and calling it explanation. You're not solving the hard problem of consciousness, you're just outsourcing it to the divine and hoping no one asks what page the solution is actually on. This is just a roundabout way to get to a God of the gaps fallacy.
At the end of the day, if you want to say it's not a coincidence, you will always need some form of intelligent design. Realistically, the causation would be a capable third party, intentionally aligning things. A third party that's motivated to do so and is already aware of subjective experience to begin with.
This is a false dichotomy. We have no evidence that intelligent design is a real thing. If we're going to speculate about things we have no evidence for, then how can you say it's either one thing or another? You're playing drag with logic. We don't always need intelligent design. You just prefer it, so you're pretending no other options exist. But here's the thing. If we're allowed to speculate beyond what can currently be proven, then why are you stopping at intelligent design being the only fantasy we're allowed to pick from? What about spiritual evolution from Eastern traditions like Hinduism or Buddhism? How about the idea that the universe itself is conscious and we're the expression of it exploring itself? What about the possibility that consciousness is an emergent byproduct of complex biological systems, seeking resources and adapting to their environment? Or maybe subjective experience is a necessary illusion, created by organisms with enough computational complexity to self-model. Hell, if we're going to go full fantasy mode, why not just say first-person experience is just the latest craze in a higher dimensional video game, where second-person experience is the norm? None of this is necessarily right, but it's no less speculative than your intelligent third party. The difference is, I'm not pretending they're definitive answers to hard questions you don't have solutions to. I'm showing you that you have not even begun to scratch the surface of possible explanations. You can't just invent a hypothetical capable third party and call it causation. That is not philosophy, that's fan fiction. Well, that's all for this video. The rest of it devolves into a statement of faith, not an argument, and there's nothing to refute without stepping into personal critique of the creator rather than his reasoning. But honestly, if you found this argument profound or thought it was a clever, novel take on intelligent design, why don't you go ahead and follow Ken Ham or Kent Hovind? Their arguments are simpler and somehow still more intellectually rigorous than this, and that's about as harsh as I can get without making it personal. If you like what I'm doing here, you can show your appreciation with the Ko-fi link in the description. Every dollar goes a long way to helping me out. If you had a run-in with bad logic or poor philosophical argumentation, why not drop a comment below and discuss it? And if you like what I do, why not consider giving me a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell? I've also got a mailing list you can join, as well as a Discord where we can discuss similar topics in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.